Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey. Being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 43 of my historical travel podcast Voyage to go History, where I guide you through the world's greatest voyages that have forever changed our understanding of nature, culture, and humanity. In the story we're currently following, we accompany 17-year-old German Georg Forster as he sails around the world with his father, a naturalist, aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook in the 18th century. In today's episode, we return to Tahiti, where the crew drops anchor again in Matavai Bay on the island's north coast. This site holds special historical importance, not just for scientific reasons, like the observation of the transit of Venus at Point Venus, but also as a vibrant center of Polynesian culture and political life. Here, Forster and the crew encounter familiar faces, witness a massive assembly of war canoes, and are offered a rare glimpse into Tahiti's shifting balance of power. Georg's original travel report was written in the language of his time. To make it more accessible, I have translated it into modern English. Occasionally, I'll also provide additional context to help you better understand the world as Georg saw it. What happened in the last episode? In the previous episode, we returned with Captain Cook and the crew to Matavai Bay on the north coast of Tahiti, where they were warmly welcomed by the islanders. Old acquaintances came aboard with gifts of fruit and fish, and tents were once again set up on Point Venus to allow for trading, woodcutting, and astronomical observations. Georg Forster, still too weak to go ashore, stayed on board and traded with the locals from his cabin window. Meanwhile, Mahin, a Polynesian, was joyfully reunited with his family. He stayed ashore, wearing local clothes and quickly returning to the lifestyle of his homeland. His sister, Te Iaoa, known for her beauty, was married to Nuna, a powerful man from Raiatea, and they welcomed him into their large family home. On board, the crew celebrated St. George's Day with drinking and company. Georg observed how some women, likely from the lower social classes, returned to the ship, just as during the last visit. At the end of the episode, the crew encountered something entirely unexpected. A massive fleet of war canoes lay along the shores of Opare. Over 150 vessels, each filled with warriors in full armor. This military show of strength left the visitors stunned, especially when they learned that the fleet was preparing for war against the nearby island of Aimeo. April 1774, Tahiti.
In the afternoon, Georg's father and Dr. Sparman went ashore, accompanied by a sailor and a marine, to hike into the mountains. Over the past few days, the supply of food and trade goods had increased significantly. The ship was constantly surrounded by canoes, in which the chiefs of neighboring districts brought their pigs and other valuable items to trade in person for red feathers, which were held in such high esteem among them. These very feathers also brought about a noticeable change in the relationships between the women and the European sailors. Fortunate was the man who had stocked up on this precious item in the Friendly Islands, He alone was surrounded by girls, and only he had his pick among the most beautiful. How widespread and irresistible the desire for red feathers was among this people became clear to them in the most convincing way. The wives of the high-ranking chiefs usually did not receive visits from Europeans, and although unmarried girls enjoyed many freedoms, married women always preserved their chastity. But the desire for red feathers overturned this distinction entirely. One commander even allowed himself to offer his wife to Captain Cook. The lady, on her husband's urging, did everything she could to seduce the captain. She knew how to display her charms with such skill that few European ladies of rank could have surpassed her in this. It pained them to hear such a proposal from a man whose character had otherwise proven irreproachable in every respect. It was Potatau who could lower himself so far from his usual dignity. They reproached him and made their disapproval clear. Fortunately, the sailors had already exchanged a large number of red feathers for other rare items in the Marquesas, before realizing how valuable these would be in Tahiti. Had all these treasures arrived at once, the price of food would no doubt have risen, and they might have fared worse than during their first stay. Even the smallest feather was valued far more highly than a piece of glass bead or a nail. A strip of cloth decorated with such feathers brought the recipient such joy as a European might feel upon unexpectedly discovering a great treasure. Potatau brought his large war helmet, nearly 1.5 meters tall, on board and sold it for red feathers. Others followed his example, and breastplates were traded in large numbers by the sailors. Even more astonishing was the fact that the islanders began selling their extraordinary mourning garments, those mentioned during Captain Cook's first voyage, which at that time had not been obtainable at any price. These garments were made from the most precious materials that land and sea could provide, crafted with great care and skill. Yet no fewer than 10 of these mourning costumes were purchased by various crew members and brought back to Europe. Captain Cook presented one to the British Museum, while Georg's father had the honor of donating a similar one to the University of Oxford, where it was placed in the Ashmolean Museum. The upper part of this special costume consisted of a flat, thin board, shaped like a crescent, about 2 feet long and 10 to 12 centimeters wide. Mounted on this board were 4 or 5 selected pieces of mother-of-pearl, intricately decorated with glass beads and coconut fibers. Hanging from the lower edge of the board was a kind of apron, made up of 10 to 15 parallel rows of small mother-of-pearl pieces, also adorned with glass beads. From the outer ends of the board, long green and yellow feathers descended, the most splendid feature of the entire costume. The decoration was secured with 2 strong cords. These were attached to the sides of 2 shells, mounted at the center of the crescent-shaped board. The cords held the entire unusual ornament tightly against the mourner's head. It hung vertically in front of him, the apron covering his chest and abdomen, the board resting before his neck and shoulders. The front shells stood directly before his face. One of them had a small hole through which the mourner could see. The uppermost shells, surrounded by long feathers, extended at least 60 centimeters above the wearer. The rest of the attire was equally remarkable. He wore a mat or a piece of cloth which, according to local custom, had a hole in the middle for the head to pass through. Over this, he placed a second garment of the same kind, its front reaching almost to the feet. It was decorated in rows with buttons made from coconut shells. A belt of twisted cloth in brown and white fastened the garment at the waist. A net-like woven cloak hung from the mourner's back. densely covered with large blue feathers. On his head, he wore a turban in brown and yellow, secured by numerous cords made of braided fabric in brown and white. A wide hood, composed of strips in brown, yellow, and white, draped from the turban over his neck and shoulders, leaving as little of the man's figure visible as possible. It was usually the closest relative of the deceased who wore this strange costume. In one hand, he held two large mother-of-pearl shells, which he rattled constantly. In the other, he carried a stick embedded with shark teeth, with which he wounded any Tahitian who happened to come near him. No one could explain where this peculiar custom originated. However, it seemed intended solely to instill fear. The fantastical attire strongly resembled the ghostly figures described in European folk tales, spirits, and night creatures. Georg suspected there was a superstitious belief behind it. Perhaps the shrouded mourner was meant to represent the spirit of the deceased, demanding mourning and tears from the survivors. To symbolize this, he would injure them with the shark-tooth staff. In a society like that of the Tahitians, which lacked widespread enlightenment, such an idea could easily take root. Still, Georg was uncertain whether this interpretation truly captured the meaning of the custom, for despite many inquiries, the islanders could give no clear explanation. They described the entire mourning ceremony in detail and named each part of the attire. But when asked why everything had to be this way and not otherwise, they had no answer. One particularly striking detail, according to Mahane, was that when a man died, the mourning ceremony was carried out by his wife, whereas in the case of a woman's death, her husband would take on the role of the shrouded mourner. Upon their return to England, the mourning garments attracted great interest among collectors of exotic curiosities. One sailor even sold his piece for 25 guineas.
The value of 25 guineas in the year of 1774 is estimated today, depending on the method of calculation, to be between 3,500 and 4,500 British pounds. That's approximately 4,000 to 6,300 euros, or about 4,300 to 6,900 US dollars. This estimate is based on a comparison of historical and modern purchasing power. At the time, a guinea had a fixed value of 21 shillings, which equals 1.05 pounds sterling. To convert that into modern equivalent, historians and economists take into account inflation, economic growth, and changes in average income, helping us understand how much something from the 18th century would cost today.
The Tahitians, however, were no less eager in their curiosity about foreign things than more civilized peoples. As soon as Mahane began recounting his experiences and showing off the treasures he had brought back, the locals continually demanded rarities from Tongatabu, Waihu, and Waitahu. They even preferred these trinkets over more practical European goods when offering food and other trade items. Feathered headdresses from Waihu and Waitahu were especially sought after, as were baskets and patterned fabrics from Tongatabu. The mats from Tongatabu, although quite similar to the local ones, also held high value for them. The sailors took advantage of the Tahitians' curiosity. They sold the mats under a false name, mats that had either been made locally or traded from other society islands. The similarities in human tastes were remarkable, especially among the less civilized peoples. The Tahitians' enthusiasm for the young Mahane's stories made this even more apparent. Everywhere he appeared, people crowded around him. The elders held him in the highest regard. Even members of the royal family sought his company. Alongside his tales, Mahine also distributed gifts. Mahine spent almost all of his time on land. He only came aboard to request something or to show the ship to acquaintances. Occasionally, he also introduced them to the captain or other officers. His stories often seemed so fantastic to the listeners that they would seek confirmation from the Europeans. The Tahitians found it particularly hard to believe in petrified rain, white mountains made of solid material that melted into water, or the never-ending daylight in the polar regions. In contrast, they found the existence of cannibals in New Zealand more credible, though they listened to such accounts with fear and disgust. A special occasion drew attention today. Mahine brought a group of people aboard who wanted to see the head of a New Zealander. This head had been preserved in alcohol by Mr. Pickersgill. Georg observed them as they examined it, and noticed that the Tahitians had their own word for this kind of head. Te-tai-ai, meaning man-eater. Through conversations with the Tahitian leaders, Georg learned of an old tradition. It told of a time when cannibals had lived on the island. These people had caused great destruction among the locals, but had long since died out. Omai confirmed this story after returning to England. Georg suspected that this tradition pointed to an earlier chapter in Tahiti's history. He believed that the Tahitians themselves might once have been cannibals. Only the fertility of their land and the pleasant climate had led them to become a more civilized people. Captain Cook himself had found traces of this practice during his first voyage to Tahiti. In one house, he discovered 15 freshly hung jawbones. Georg wondered whether these had been trophies taken from defeated enemies. The following morning, a Tahitian was caught trying to steal a water barrel near the tents. He was arrested and brought aboard. Otu and Toha, who came aboard early, learned of the incident. Together with Captain Cook, they accompanied the thief ashore to witness his punishment. The man was tied to a post and, with their consent, received 24 lashes. The gathered natives who witnessed the scene were struck with fear and began to scatter. Toha called them back and gave a short speech lasting about 4 to 5 minutes. He explained that the punishment was justified and necessary. He emphasized that the Europeans, despite all their power, neither stole nor used violence. Instead, they paid fairly for everything and often gave gifts without expecting anything in return. He pointed out that it was disgraceful to steal from friends, and such acts had to be punished. His sensible and righteous words left an impression on the audience. The admirable old man gained even more respect through this speech. The assembled Tahitians seemed convinced. That afternoon, Toha visited the ship again, this time accompanied by his wife. She was already of advanced age and, at first glance, appeared as upright as he did. Their large double canoe, which had a covered rear section, was rowed by 8 men. They invited Mr. Hodges and Georg to visit them ashore. Together, they sailed to Pare. During the crossing, Toha asked many detailed questions about England. He believed that Mr. Banks must be the brother of the king, and that Captain Cook had to be the Grand Admiral of England. He listened with great attention and amazement. But when he learned that there were neither coconuts nor breadfruit trees in England, he considered the country, despite all its other merits, to be unattractive. At his residence, Toha had fish and fruit served and urged the guests to eat with him. Although they had just had lunch, they didn't want to refuse his invitation. They sat down and enjoyed the food. But before they could begin, Toha asked them to wait. A servant brought out a European kitchen knife and bamboo sticks to use as forks. Toha cut the food himself and ate in the European style. He proudly showed how he had adopted the eating customs of the Europeans. His wife ate in the traditional manner of the land, at some distance. After the meal, they took a walk and continued their conversation until sunset. Then, Toha and his wife returned in their canoe to the district of Atahuru, part of which belonged to Toha. They said their goodbyes warmly and promised to return soon. Georg and Mr. Hodges rented a double canoe and returned to the ship just before nightfall. There they met Dr. Sparman and Georg's father, who had just returned from their botanical mountain expedition. They were accompanied by Nuna, a lively young man. The hike had begun in the afternoon. They first had to cross 2 valleys and 2 steep mountains, whose paths had become very slippery due to the rain. On the first day, they only made it to the second mountain ridge. There, they found a lonely hut, where a man lived with his wife and 3 children. The family welcomed them warmly. The man expanded the roof of his hut with branches, prepared them a meal, and lit a fire, which they watched over in turns throughout the night. The fire was visible from the ship, while the travelers, in their mountain shelter, could clearly hear the ship's bell at midnight, even though they were more than 5 kilometers away. The night was pleasantly cool, though the coughing of their host disturbed their sleep. At daybreak, they continued their climb. Tahia, the head of the household, carried a large load of coconuts and led the way. The path grew increasingly difficult. Often, they had to walk along narrow paths on rugged hillsides, with steep drops on both sides. The rain-slicked trails made progress even more difficult and dangerous. At a considerable altitude, they found the steep areas covered in dense thickets and tall trees. Even the most inaccessible spots were eagerly explored in search of new plants. Only the sudden appearance of a nearby rock crevice made them pause. Higher up, the forest stretched across the entire mountain. There, they discovered plants that could not be found in the lower regions. When they reached the next mountain peak, they came upon a particularly dangerous section. At the same time, heavy rain began to fall. Tahia used the opportunity to tell them it was too dangerous to continue. Still, they wanted to try. They set down their heavy bags of plants and provisions, took only a rifle, and in half an hour, they actually reached the summit. The rain eased and the clouds parted. From the top, they could see far across the sea, all the way to the islands of Huahine, Tetiaroa, and Tapuaman. Below them lay the fertile plain and valley of Matavai, with a winding river. The view was incredibly charming. But toward the southern side of the island, nothing could be seen because of the thick clouds. After just a few moments, the horizon and the surroundings were once again covered. A dense fog rolled in, soaking them to the skin. During the descent, Georg's father had the misfortune of falling on a rocky patch. He injured his leg so badly that he nearly lost consciousness. But he recovered and tried to keep going. He soon realized that the pain in his foot was the lesser issue. The fall had caused another injury, one that would require him to wear a bandage from then on. On the way down, Georg's father leaned on their faithful guide, Tahia. By 4 in the afternoon, they had all returned aboard. According to their account, the uppermost mountains consisted of a very firm and tough clay soil, in which plants thrived remarkably well. In the forests, they found numerous unknown types of herbs and woods. They tried to find the fragrant plant the Tahitians used to perfume their oil. Tahea showed them various plants used for that purpose, but the most precious kind he either could not or would not reveal. Omai had told Georg that more than 14 different plants were used on Tahiti to make perfume. This showed how important pleasant scents and balsamic aromas were to the Tahitians. Since the trade in red feathers had begun, the number of women on board had greatly increased. Especially on this day, they had appeared in such numbers that some, having found no companion, wandered about the upper deck. Along with the red feathers, they were likely drawn by the pork. For common people, it was rarely available, so they often asked the sailors to invite them to eat. But their appetite was often greater than their ability to digest. As a result, they paid for their overindulgence with restless nights. In the morning, the decks often looked like the footpaths on shore, where the Tahitians relieved themselves. In the evenings, the women would split into groups and dance on the various decks. Their cheerfulness often turned into exuberance and was usually very loud. Yet at times, they showed real wit and originality. One sailor, feeling well again after recovering from scurvy, wanted to follow the example of his crewmates. He spoke to a girl and took her, at dusk, to his sleeping place, where he lit a lamp. When she looked at his face, she noticed that he had only one eye. Without saying a word, she took him by the hand and led him to another girl who also had only one eye. She said this girl would be a better match for him, because she didn't want anything to do with a blind or one-eyed man. 2 days later, Georg's father felt better from the strain of his last mountain expedition and the injury from his fall. He went ashore and met Oreti, the chief of the district of Ohidea, where Bougainville had once anchored. Oreti asked Captain Cook whether he would see Bougainville when he returned to England. When Cook said no, Oreti turned to Georg's father and asked him the same question. Georg's father replied that it wasn't impossible since Bougainville lived in a different country. Oreti said, "If you see my friend, tell him I miss him and would like to see him again. So you don't forget, I'll send you a pig from my district." Georg's father later passed on this message in Paris and gave Bougainville a portrait of Oreti, painted by Mr. Hodges. Oreti then said that Bougainville had 2 ships, and that there had been a woman on board one of them. But, he added, the woman had not been beautiful. He kept speaking about this, as it seemed very strange to him that a woman would dare to travel the world among so many men. In April of 1768, the Tahitians had recognized, just by the way the person walked, that the servant of the naturalist Commerson, who was on board at the time, was actually a woman disguised as a man. Throughout the entire voyage, no one on board had noticed. This person, having suffered misfortunes in the past, had denied her gender, worked as a servant in Paris, and joined the voyage out of curiosity. Bougainville attested to her impeccable conduct and noted that she had been 27 years old at the time. Oreti confirmed the news they had already heard during their first stay, that a Spanish ship had been here. However, he assured them that neither he nor his people thought highly of the Spaniards. Oreti was the living image of a lively, cheerful, and generous old man. Despite his gray hair, he was as healthy and vigorous as old people in Tahiti often were. He spoke of battles in which he had fought and proudly showed his scars. One particularly deep scar on his head, caused by a thrown stone, reminded him of past conflicts. He also mentioned having fought at the side of Tutaha, when the latter lost his life. The next morning, Dr. Sparman went with Georg into the valley of Matavai, which the locals called Tua Uru. Georg, due to his previous weakness, had not ventured this far before. The sight of the plant life appeared to him like an entirely new spectacle. It was all the more splendid, as spring had renewed everything, filling field and forest with new life. The great improvements throughout the entire district astonished him. Everywhere, the inhabitants had established new, spacious plantations, all in excellent order. The number of newly built houses was considerable, and in many places they saw canoes under construction. All of this showed how heavily the former war between the two peninsulas must have affected this particular part of the larger one. But although the area had still shown clear signs of devastation during their first stay, no trace of it remained now. The land resembled a well-stocked pantry. In front of every house, they saw pigs grazing in the grass, no longer hidden from view, as had once been the case. Georg was pleased to observe that the prosperity of the people had also changed their behavior. No one bothered them anymore with begging for glass beads or nails. Instead of hoarding food, people now outdid one another in hospitality and generosity. They could hardly pass a single hut without being invited in and offered provisions. The joyful willingness with which the islanders gave what they had was always deeply moving. Around 10 o'clock, they reached the home of the hospitable local, who had previously welcomed them so kindly when they had come down exhausted from the mountains. Once again, he greeted them with a few coconuts and invited them to have lunch at his hut on their way back. After they accepted, he immediately ordered preparations to be made and accompanied them as they continued up the valley. Behind his house, there were no more dwellings, as the mountains in this area rose steeply and stood very close together. About a mile farther on, the eastern mountainside consisted of a sheer rock wall at least 12 meters high. Above this rock formation, the slope became more gradual again and was thickly covered with brush far up the hillside. A beautiful waterfall tumbled from the summit down along the rock wall into the river, enlivening an otherwise dark, shadowy, and romantically wild landscape. Even from a distance, one could see many sharply defined vertical ridges running along the cliff face. When they waded through the water to examine them more closely, they found that the entire rock face was made of dense black basalt columns. The islanders used this type of stone to make their tools. The columns were about 40 to 45 centimeters in diameter. They stood upright, parallel, and tightly packed, with each column showing one, or at most, two sharp ridges protruding from the cliff's surface. As it is now widely believed that basalt is of volcanic origin, this formation offered further strong evidence that Tahiti had undergone significant changes due to subterranean fire. Beyond the basalt columns, the valley narrowed further as the mountains closed in more tightly. The passable section extended no more than 2 or 3 kilometers. After covering this stretch on very difficult paths and fording the river, which wound across the valley at least 50 times, they reached the point that Banks had described as the farthest destination of his hike. They too found it impossible to go any farther and turned back, tired and exhausted. On the return journey, they discovered a few more new plants here and there and reached their kind host's home within 2 hours. There they enjoyed the abundant fruits and herbs he had set out for them. They gave him as many red feathers as he wished. Still, they also gave him various iron tools, so that when the feathers were long lost or used up, a useful remembrance of their presence would remain. His daughter, whom they had seen during their previous visit, was now married to a man of high rank. The gifts they had once given her had made her one of the most sought-after matches in the entire country. However, she now lived far away. Captain Cook, Georg's father, and several officers had gone to Opare to visit O2. There, they were shown a place where a war canoe was being built. The king wanted to name the vessel O Tahiti. Captain Cook, however, expressed the wish to name it Britannia, and to that end he presented the king with a small British flag, a miniature anchor, and the appropriate rope. His Majesty immediately agreed to the name change. The flag was raised, and the people, much like the sailors, expressed their approval with 3 loud cheers of joy. Georg had recommended that Mr. Hodges visit the impressive cascade in the valley, as its picturesque appearance made it a perfect subject for a drawing. The following day, Mr. Hodges went there with a few other gentlemen and made sketches of the waterfall and the basalt columns beneath it. In his absence, they enjoyed a large albacore aboard. However, no one who ate it digested it well. The flesh caused a sudden flush in the face, accompanied by severe headaches. Some also suffered from diarrhea. A servant who had eaten the fish as his main meal was afflicted with violent vomiting and strong diarrhea. It was likely that the fish had been caught using a narcotic plant, and its harmful properties had transferred into the meat. Around this time, they learned that Mahena had married the daughter of a local commander named Topare, who lived in the Matavai Valley. One of their young naval officers, who brought the news, boasted that he had attended the wedding and had witnessed the ceremonies. But, when asked to describe them, he admitted, "They were indeed quite unusual, but I can't recall any details, nor could I describe them." Thus, a remarkable opportunity to learn more about the customs of this people was lost. It was unfortunate that no more attentive observer had been present who might have at least reported what he had seen. Mahine came aboard with his newlywed wife. She was still very young, small in stature, and not particularly attractive, but she was remarkably skilled at begging. She wandered all over the ship asking for gifts, and since her husband was well liked by all, she received a great number of glass beads, nails, shirts, and red feathers. The newly married husband explained that he planned to settle on Tahiti, as he had been offered land, a house, and property there. He had been accepted into the family of an Eri, enjoyed the respect of the king, and was held in high regard by the people. One of his friends had already assigned him a tautau, a young servant whose duty it was to attend, accompany, and assist him at all times. Although Mahinen had given up the idea of traveling to England, the lively Nuna, who had already expressed similar plans, still held fast to them. He continued to urge Georg's father and other gentlemen to take him on board. Georg's father, who had always liked Nuna, was willing to take him along at his own expense, and the captain gave his immediate approval under that condition. However, they made it clear to the boy that he could not expect ever to return to his homeland, as it was uncertain whether a ship would ever again be sent to Tahiti. But Nuna was so thrilled by the prospect of the voyage that no objection could dissuade him. He willingly gave up the hope of ever seeing his native land again in order to discover theirs instead. His joy, however, was short-lived. That evening, the captain changed his mind and revoked his promise, leaving poor Nuna behind in bitter disappointment. Georg's father had planned to have him learn the trade of carpentry and blacksmithing. With these skills, he might one day have returned as a more useful member of society than his countryman Omai, who, after nearly 2 years in England, had brought back little more than the ability to entertain the islanders with a hurdy-gurdy or puppet show.
Omai was a young Polynesian man from the island of Raiatea in the South Pacific. He first met Europeans when the British arrived in Tahiti during early contact between island societies and European explorers. Conflict between island fractions had forced him to flee Raiatea, and he found refuge among Tahitians. When Captain Cook's second voyage aboard the HMS Resolution reached Tahiti in 1773, Omai expressed a strong desire to travel with the British. Cook agreed, seeing the opportunity for cultural exchange and hoping Omai might help improve relations between Europeans and Polynesian peoples. He sailed to England on the ship Adventure, commanded by Captain Tobias Forster, while Cook continued exploring the Pacific. Omai arrived in England in 1774 and became a sensation in London society. Aristocrats and scientists were fascinated by his stories and his homeland. He met King Georg III, attended fashionable gatherings, and lived for a time under the care of influential patrons like Sir Joseph Banks. During his stay, he learned English and European customs. Yet he always remained visibly foreign in a society eager to display him as a curiosity from a distant part of the world. After 2 years in Britain, Cook returned from his voyage and agreed to take Omai back home. In 1776, Omai sailed with Cook on the Third Pacific Expedition. The British hoped that his experience in England would strengthen friendly ties with Raiatea and Tahiti. When they reached the Society Islands in 1777, Omai was provided with a house, servants, and a store of European goods to help him re-establish his status. However, the political situation in his homeland remained unstable, and Omai struggled to secure lasting authority or protection. After Cook departed, little is known for certain about his final years. Most accounts suggest that Omai's adopted European lifestyle could not protect him from the ongoing local conflicts, and he likely died only a few years after his return. His story symbolizes both the promise and the human cost of first cross-cultural encounters between Pacific Islanders and Europe, full of hope, misunderstanding, admiration, and irretrievable change. That brings us to the end of episode 43 of Georg Forster's journey around the world aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. This episode took us deep into the lush, mountainous interior of Tahiti and into the heart of its society, where red feathers, ritual mourning garments, and personal encounters revealed a world both foreign and deeply human. A map with the key locations from this episode, including Matavai Valley and the rugged basal cliffs, can be found in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you'll find a PayPal link in the description. Our journey with Georg Forster, Captain Cook, and the Resolution continues, and I'd love to have you along for the next chapter. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.